friends, and welcome to episode 3 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Don't forget, you can subscribe at our Substack page, robbreakenridge.ca, which is where this podcast is hosted. You can also listen and subscribe on Spotify, Amazon Music, and our YouTube channel, and we should hopefully soon be found on Apple Podcasts. A lot to get to on this edition of the program. Coming up shortly, we're going to hear from Philippe Lagassé, Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, leading expert on Canada's Parliament and Constitution, also on defense and foreign policy. It's some issues the federal government has to get to on that front, but also to talk about the Canadian monarchy and the importance of having Canada's king read the speech from the throne. Later on today, we'll talk about what's going on at Canada Post. Ian Lee at the Sprott School of Business, someone who knows the ins and outs of Canada Post and the big problems facing Canada's post office. We've got another strike imminent, perhaps, but also ongoing significant losses at Canada Post. All kinds of questions about what kind of future it can and should have. Plus, later on today, a fascinating new book on the significance and the impact of the Trans-Canada Highway. Craig Baird is author of Canada's Main Street, the epic story of the Trans-Canada Highway. He'll be with us later. First, though, as mentioned, we got a speech from the throne coming up on Tuesday, perhaps all said and done by the time you're actually listening to this podcast. And then from there, we'll see what the government actually has in store. It's been a lot of big, ambitious talk from Mark Carney about Canada's economy, the need to build housing, build infrastructure. More specifically, though, as it pertains to Alberta, there's a lot of interest in how this new government will go about building a new relationship, what sort of new direction we're going to see with regard to energy development and new partnerships. And again, we've heard a lot of big talk on those fronts. But if last week's speech in Calgary by the new Minister of Energy and Natural Resources is any indication, there could be some cause for optimism here. Tim Hodgson was saying all the right things, but for now, of course, it's just words. But then again, why say it if there's no intention to follow through? Why get people's hopes up and dashed again, while also antagonizing people who are opposed to such developments and projects in the first place? If it's all just talk and deliberately so, then it's a strategy that will backfire in multiple ways on this government. But it seems to me on the flip side that if this is genuine, that could be a political win for this government, not just in terms of public opinion in Alberta, but in public opinion across the country where there is a lot of support for this kind of a focus and these kinds of projects right now. So I think it's politically smart to do all of this. Whether they do, obviously, remains to be seen. But let me just play for you a few clips of Hodgson's speech if you missed it, so you can sort of hear and judge for yourself. So the first one here is where he's getting kind of specific about, this new approach to getting projects approved, right? And that's been a big problem, I think, in this country, just how long it takes and all of the uncertainty. So here's the minister saying, look, we're going to be about delivery, not delay. We're going to build. We're going to have shorter timelines, etc. Here's what he had to say on that front.
I want to be very clear. In the new economy we are building, Canada will no longer be defined by delay. We will be defined by delivery. So what does that mean? It begins with a vision to build Canada into a conventional and clean energy and natural resources superpower. We have the resources. We have the people. We have the ideas. And we now have a government determined to lead and help unlock the potential of Canadian workers and businesses. We are taking major steps to back that vision with action. First, we will identify and fast-track projects of national interest. These are the projects that matter to our economy, our environment, and our sovereignty. No more 5-year reviews. Decisions will come in 2 years for all projects. It's about making one project, one review real. Less red tape, more certainty, better outcomes. And we're doing this not just for speed, but for purpose, for Canada. Because Canadian energy is not just about domestic prosperity, it's a tool for global stability and transformation. It's high time we trade more with people who share our values, not just our borders.
And specifically as it pertains to oil and gas, because, they talk in broad strokes about clean and conventional energy, but here he is talking about oil and gas specifically and the new vision this new government has.
Let's start with oil and gas. Canada will remain a reliable global supplier, not just today, but for decades to come. The real challenge is not whether we produce, but whether we can get the best products to market before someone else does. We need infrastructure that gets our energy to Tidewater and to trusted allies, diversifying beyond the United States. We will invest in carbon capture, methane reduction, and other technologies to ensure Canadian oil and gas is not only produced responsibly, but is the most competitive in the world. All of us, governments and industry, need to get the Pathways Project done. This government will not be a government of talk, but a government of action. We need the same from our partners in the province of Alberta and the Pathways Alliance. Your federal government has committed to certainty, to support, and to making Canada an energy superpower. But we need partners who are also willing to make good on their promises.
Okay, one more here from the minister. And he talks about the relationship with Alberta, resetting that relationship, and also even specifically saying that he intends to be a voice for Alberta in this government.
Let me talk a little bit about the reset in our relationship, and specifically about Alberta. I was sworn in as an MP on Tuesday. I don't know where the bathroom is yet. I went to my first cabinet meeting on Wednesday, and I got on a plane Wednesday night and went to Regina. That's a signal, guys. That's a signal that I understand the Prairies isn't just Alberta. We also have a partner in Saskatchewan. And after I spent time with Deputy Premier Ryder, I got on a plane and came here. And as you've heard, I've been talking with industry leaders, First Nations, and my partners in the Alberta government. This relationship matters, and I'm committed to a clean slate. I may live in Toronto right now, but I was born in the Prairies. I want you to understand that I will also be a voice for Alberta and Western Canada around the cabinet table.
Okay, so that's Tim Hodgson. He's the new Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, someone who has an extensive business background, someone who worked in the oil and gas sector for a few years, in fact, at MEG Energy. So I think that's all a positive sign, just in terms of his history in the industry, what he's saying, what the Prime Minister has signaled in terms of a new direction. We'll see. Right. Again, it's still all talk right now, but certainly I think at least encouraging words. Now we got to see the follow through. So big challenges, of course, for this government. And I think this really needs to be the week where we get a sense of how this is all going to be done. Because it's been a lot of rhetoric up until now, but how does the rubber meet the road? What does the government intend to do? How is all of this going to happen? So hopefully we'll get a clear sense of all of that this week. Now, I don't know that the speech from the throne is going to get too specific into all of that, but I definitely expect, and like I say, you may have already heard it by the time you hear this podcast, that it will hit these themes. But I think a lot of significance in the fact that it is going to be read in person by Canada's King, King Charles. Typically, the Governor General would read the speech from the throne, but King Charles is in Canada and is reading the speech from the throne. So that's definitely significant and deliberate on Mark Carney's part to invite the king and sort of have this spectacle and send this message. Now, how do people feel about all of this? A couple of new polls out this week. One, more specific from the Angus Reid Institute, finds that 83% of Canadians, it's a big number, 83% of Canadians say they are indifferent or don't care about the king's visit and him reading the throne speech in particular. But as for our appreciation of the monarchy itself, the institution itself, I think there remains broad support. Maybe those levels were higher when we still had the Queen, because I think there was a fondness for the Queen. Maybe that's not quite there for King Charles. But for example, there's another poll done by Polaris Strategic Insights, and finds specifically in Alberta, Albertans support the continuation of Crown rule in the province, even if there are questions about the province's future in Canada. Support for the monarchy is at a net +9 in Alberta, as the National Post reports, with 46% of Albertans saying that Canada should remain a constitutional monarchy, 37% saying it should ditch the Crown. I believe it was also, I think, Colby Kosh in the National Post who made the point that there is that level of appreciation among Albertans. But those who talk about Alberta separation often talk about a republic of Alberta as opposed to a dominion of Alberta, or an Alberta that's part of the Commonwealth or still has the crown or the king as the head of state. But there's a real history to it and a meaning to it. And I think Canada's been well served by our system of government. But at the same time, too, maybe there's a lack of understanding as to how this all works. I think King Charles is maybe not viewed as Canada's king, but rather Britain's king, the king of the United Kingdom. And we've invited a foreign king to come to Canada to read the speech from the throne. But that would be inaccurate and a misunderstanding of how all of this works. The King of Canada, the Canadian crown, is a unique, specific institution. And King Charles is the holder of that position. He is the King of Canada. So joining us for more on how all of this works, understanding the role of the monarchy, the role of the king, the significance of having the king reading the speech from the throne and being here in Canada. And I do also want to talk about some issues around defense policy and procurement that this new government is going to have to face. And our next guest certainly has a lot of expertise on that as well. Philippe Lagassé, Associate Professor and Barton Chair at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, also co-editor of the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal. Philippe, great to have you with us here today. Welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, Rob.
Let's start with the throne speech and the fact that King Charles, I guess this will be the third occasion now we've had the monarch actually read the speech from the throne. First of all, just kind of the significance in the ceremony of the throne speech itself, which is a way of kicking off session of Parliament, allowing the government to get to work. What is the significance of that, first of all?
So it's important to recognize that, constitutionally speaking, the Parliament is composed of the monarch, the Senate, and the House of Commons. We tend to think of Parliament as simply including the two houses of Parliament, but in fact, it does include the Crown. And therefore, the Crown's role in opening Parliament or opening a session of Parliament, in this case, it's a new Parliament, is really indicative of the monarch's continuing role in that institution. And they as well, in line with our constitutional conventions, are there to read out the executive's program for this Parliament as well. So in keeping with the Westminster tradition, that also links the legislature and the executive, we have, through the person of the monarch in this case, an outline of what the government's plan is for this Parliament.
So typically the Governor General would read the speech from the throne, but it is of some significance that the King himself is going to be here to read the speech. Now, this is, where there's a bit of a civics lesson, I suppose, for Canadians and understanding the institution of the Canadian monarch. King Charles is the King of Canada. Is there maybe a lack of understanding in this country, do you think, around that?
Yes, I would agree with you. I think to a lot of people, it is the British monarch coming to open the Canadian Parliament, which strikes some people as odd. But to your point, it is a separate office. The King of Canada and the King, as referenced in both the Constitution Act 1867 now and the Constitution Act 1982, is a separate office from the King of the United Kingdom. And indeed, the Canadian government recently altered the Royal Thousand Titles to make that even clearer. Right now, the King's title is simply King of Canada and his other realms. So it is important to note that this is a purely Canadian office, formally speaking. We share it, so we're in a personal union with the United Kingdom and the King's other realms. But he is performing this as the King of Canada, not the King of the United Kingdom.
It's infrequent, as mentioned. I think the last time was, 1977 when the Queen read the speech from the throne. So what is the significance then of having the actual monarch read the speech from the throne?
Well, I think in this particular case, obviously it is responding to questions about our sovereignty and doing so with an individual who the American president is known to admire and respect. And so having the king, who, again, is well respected by President Trump, come and really demonstrate the importance of Canadian sovereignty. And as the personification of that sovereignty, the king, when we talk about a monarch, the other title that they have is the sovereign. And so they are the personification, really, of the Canadian state, still in law. And to have them open this parliament at this moment when there are questions being raised about our future as an independent country, I think is quite significant in that respect.
Is it also a symbol of the past, or a symbol of Canada's history, tradition, institutions, and a way of sending a message about what Canada is as a country?
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, it's important to recognize that our institutions date back 1,000 years, and we inherited them from the United Kingdom, and we've made them our own. But it is also highlighting that the institutions that we have been around for centuries, and we have adapted them. We've changed them to meet our needs and our ambitions, but they are enduring, and they will endure into the future. So it is making this case that we're dealing with institutions that have lived through a wide arc of history and have been through lots of different changes, but that doesn't deny their importance. And I think equally important to highlight that our system of government is different from the American one, and that we have our own pride in it.
And I mean, there is division in Canada around the institution. And then maybe to some extent, we have King Charles, who maybe Canadians aren't quite as fond of as maybe they were of the Queen. And by inviting him here, I guess that does open that debate. I mean, I don't know that we need to necessarily shy away from the debate, but what are some of the realities that need to shape that conversation, do you think?
Well, I think the key thing for me is those who would want us to move away from the crown as kind of the core foundation of our state would need to come up with some kind of plausible alternative that we can all agree on. And in the absence of that, the reality is that unless you have some kind of alternative that you can rally Canadians around, well, this is the Constitution that we have, and why we should probably learn to work with it and better understand it than to simply grasp at some ephemeral idea of some alternative. And as we've seen in other countries, such as Australia, who have contemplated moving away from constitutional monarchy, it's pretty difficult to come up with something everybody can agree with about what would replace it. And in the Canadian case in particular, we might think of some of the foundational pieces of our country, such as the treaties that exist between the Crown and First Nations, would need to be understood as part of some alternative, and that you would want and need to get the agreement of those First Nations who have a treaty relationship with the Crown before you move ahead.
Is there something to be said then for that stability, that longevity, that tradition, right? Is there a strong case to be made for this system as it is?
I would agree. I would say so. I mean, again, this is a system that has endured many different monarchs over several centuries. It's endured a civil war in England, been restored, undergone a glorious revolution in 1689 that made the crown subject to the will of Parliament. In our case now, it was originally Canada being confederated under the crown of the United Kingdom, and eventually we secured our sovereignty and autonomy and independence through an independent Canadian crown. And that crown is now part of the Constitution of Canada as the highest law. So it's an enduring system, one that has met our purposes, and one that really reflects what I would argue is a state of many nations. And when you have a state of many nations, it becomes more difficult to say that sovereignty should reside in the people, particularly because we would have difficulties in some cases defining what that is. It is an institution that's bound lots of different nations under a single state, and it's been quite successful in doing so.
Now, as to who is or should be the monarch, and you alluded to some changes we made recently that's kind of spelled that out, because, we know where King Charles lives. He's going to come here and he's going to speak and he's going to have an accent that reminds us of all of that. The idea maybe that if we're going to have a king or queen of Canada, that person could or should be Canadian. What about that challenge?
Well, I would argue that one of the great benefits that we've had is that the monarch is not resident. We get a lot of benefits for a very little cost. A lot of people criticize the cost of the royals in the United Kingdom. I mean, the reality is it's largely self-funded. That's kind of not well understood in the UK either. But the reality is Canadians have a Monarch that they pay very little for. It costs about $1 or maybe $1.25 to maintain the Vice Regal offices in Canada per person. And we get quite a bit of benefit of both a hereditary system that acts as the ultimate fire extinguisher, but also appointees that both in the provinces and at the federal level that can fulfill a lot of the head of state functions. And perhaps even more importantly, as we're seeing when we look at the United States, the importance that we have in our system of having a clear demarcation between the head of state function and the head of government function. It's important in our system to know that there's always two people ahead or above the prime minister. There's the governor general, and then there's the monarch. And at a time when people have questions around power and how it's being used, I think it's an inherent virtue of our system that there is that clear demarcation between those who rule and those who reign.
So let's talk about some of the challenges now facing this government. The speech from the throne will be read. They'll get on with the business of governing. I mean, focusing on the economy, these issues are at the forefront. But when it comes to defense policy and procurement, there's some big challenges facing this government. Obviously, a commitment that we're going to get to 2% of GDP being spent on defense as per our NATO commitments. We got fighter jets, shipbuilding. There's some big procurement challenges. What stand out to you, first of all, in terms of the biggest challenges or priorities facing this government on this front?
So as you alluded to, we're trying to get to 2% of defense spending as a portion of GDP by 2030. And one of the biggest challenges the government's going to face is just finding a way to spend that money wisely and smartly. The fact of the matter is that even though the federal government has grown quite considerably over the past decade, you don't necessarily have more capacity in terms of defense procurement. So you have a number of people already trying to move a lot of program through the system. And unless the defense procurement system is greatly simplified and you also expand the number of people that are working on that file, as counterintuitive as it may seem, you're going to have difficulty really spending that money and, as importantly, spending it smartly, which I think is going to be the other big challenge. That being said, there are a number of projects that the previous government of Justin Trudeau and now Mr. Carney's government have already kind of intimated that they're going to move ahead with, such as submarines, early airborne warning aircraft, and other things. So there's a number of low-hanging fruit there that they can move on. But I would say the biggest challenge is going to be, how do we do procurement of new types of systems in a way that is different from what we've done it in the past? And I'm thinking in particular of small autonomous systems that you cycle through at a very high pace that are very different from how you buy those than buying big warships, for instance. So our system is really made to buy these very long-term procurements of very big things, and not so well suited to doing rapid procurements of very exhaustible assets.
Well, how much just does maybe foreign policy and almost industrial policy creep into this? The idea that maybe we can build some of this ourselves, and then that's, creates jobs, and there's that spin-off, and also the question of from whom do we purchase these things, and our relationships, like with the Americans most obviously, but Europeans or maybe even South Korea in the case of submarines. How does that all factor in?
So you're right. I mean, a lot of the equipment that we've been buying since 2017 has been American. And I suspect that the government's going to be under a good deal of pressure from Canadians not to continue down that preferential road when it comes to American technology. Which isn't to say that we're not going to do so when it suits our interests, but there is going to be interest in building new partnerships. You've mentioned some of the possibilities that are out there. A conventional submarine, for instance, is not a product that the Americans sell. So we would either get it from Germany or Sweden or South Korea, for instance. Similarly, the government has promised to buy the airborne early warning aircraft from a domestic manufacturer. So that seems to indicate Bombardier, that has built that kind of platform in the past for other countries. But to your other point, when it comes to a lot of these small systems, so autonomous air systems, so drones or autonomous underwater systems, we probably should be emphasizing Canadian producers of that. These are systems that we have the knowledge and have the know-how and have the manufacturing capacity to build. And so we should really be building Canadian capacity in that regard. By the same token, the war in Ukraine has really exposed the need to develop far greater capacity in terms of munitions. And that could be an area where Canada could stand out as a champion within the NATO alliance generally. We should become a munitions powerhouse. and really be able to supply our allies. That's another opportunity where if the government is smart, they could really leverage a lot of our capacity. And a lot of that manufacturing capacity, I would even note, may come under a lot of pressure as part of the trade war with the United States. So we may have some excess manufacturing that we could redirect towards some of these defense goals.
We talk about fighter jets specifically, and what a mess this has been, right? As it took a long time to decide on the F-35s, then we changed our mind, and then we came back to the F-35s, and I guess we're at the starting point of filling that contract, but now questions, maybe we should also go with some other fighter jets because of some of these challenges with the U.S. So where are things at, first of all, with fighter jets, and what can we learn from how we've gone about that?
So to your point, it took us quite a bit of time to land on the F-35, over a decade. Number of different studies, lots of different evaluations, and then a fair and open, transparent competition to finally arrive at that. Right now, we're contracted to buy an initial 16, but we have 88 is the objective for the F-35. It's equally important to note that we're not just buying the planes, we're also buying a lot of training infrastructure, general operating infrastructure, munitions. So you can't really only buy 16 given everything else that you're putting in place to absorb that fleet. And similarly, the CF-18s are very much at the end of their life. So they're on life support, really. Were you to simply pause the F-35 purchase right now, you would risk not having any fighter capability for the next little while if you're not careful. So as a number of people have suggested, the alternative would not so much be abandoning the F-35 as potentially complementing it with another European fighter. And that's a possibility. There are a number of existing European fighter aircraft that are available, the Rafale, the Eurofighter, and the Gripen. Another possibility that's been floated is not buying the existing European aircraft, but partnering with European and Asian allies to develop a sixth generation aircraft, which they're already doing. So, for instance, the UK and Japan and Italy are working on something called the Tempest. So perhaps Canada gets on board with that and complements its F-35 fleet with another generation later.
And then at the same time, maybe there's further integration happening with the U.S. and the possibility of a new missile defense system that Canada might be a part of. Now, maybe this does expand off what exists with NORAD, but this is also something very new and very different. And by the way, I mean, if we're going to spend money on that, is that spending that would count toward our 2% target?
To your point, we still already do a bit of missile defense in North America through NORAD. So we deal with cruise missiles through the existing arrangements, so what are called air-breathing threats. So anything that's got a jet engine on it, whether it's a missile or a plane, NORAD already deals with that. NORAD also already does early warning of ballistic missile launches. So if we were to expand our role in that, it would be a continuation of what we've already been doing with NORAD. And similarly, I think the Carney government is open to this simply because, as they've expressed, if you're going to defend Canadian airspace, you should probably have a say in that. So if this Golden Dome, whatever it looks like, ends up intercepting missiles headed for Canada, we should probably be in the room. Some people will question why we're doing that because we've declared that we want to be less integrated with the United States. I think the reality check to all that is that we will always defend the continent alongside the United States. The depth of that cooperation will vary, and as the Prime Minister said, we'll do it on a case-by-case basis. But that spending and that effort is going to definitely count towards our 2%. And I think we should all just take a pause here and see what it ends up looking like and what is actually asked of Canada. And the government's going to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
I mean, this was a huge issue in the 80s. I mean, even 20 years ago, this came up and was controversial. Is it a little bit different now, do you think?
I would argue that things have changed since these initial debates. The reality is Canada supports ballistic missile defense for NATO, and yet it doesn't support it for itself. So we've been in this very odd kind of strange, ambiguous relationship with this technology where we think it's great for our allies, and yet we've hesitated to do it for ourselves. So finally coming to grips with ballistic missile defense would be reconciling our different policy positions on this. By the same token, the threat has increased, and we have to recognize that there is a greater ballistic missile threat to North America, notably even from North Korea and eventually from Iran. So we have to be cognizant of that, and we don't want to be held hostage by these potential launches. So I think the debate has moved on. I think it's going to be more a question of how deeply integrated we want to be with the United States, not necessarily a debate over ballistic missile defense per se.
Well, some important consequential decisions lie ahead for this government for sure. We'll leave it there. Professor Lagassé, again, appreciate your insight on all of this. Thank you so much for making some time for us here today.
Thanks, Rob.
And welcome back. Thanks for being with us on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Our thanks once again to Philippe Lagassé, Barton Chair at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. We'll actually kind of transition here from one Carleton University expert to another as we transition from a conversation around, in part, the Canadian monarchy to another different kind of Canadian institution, that being Canada Post, and what the future holds for Canada's post office. It's been rather tumultuous on the labor front. We had a disruptive strike, of course, late last year from kind of mid-November to mid-December. Now, barely 5 months later, we seem to be on the cusp of another strike. As we record this podcast, Canada Post workers are not on strike. They're in a legal strike position, and they have, I guess, banned overtime. Members aren't doing overtime, so some job action of sorts underway. But this comes as well, the report that was done on the heels of that last strike, looking at the future of Canada Post and painting a pretty bleak picture about an existential crisis and massive losses at Canada Post. So what can be done? I wrote a piece that you can find at our Substack page, robbreakenridge.ca, just to the fact that we're going through all of this again. Something's got to give. The status quo of labor disruptions, the status quo of losses for businesses, and of course, the whole status quo of the big losses at Canada Post itself. Like, this can't go on. So there's some ideas in this report I referenced, and these are the ideas that have been out there for a while about how we can maybe reform Canada Post, scale back, refocus what it does, or even refocus where it does what it does, focus more on rural or remote areas. Or for that matter, we could just look at just maybe selling the whole thing off, privatizing Canada Post, leaving all of that to the private sector. I mean, other countries have done that. And there are other kind of basic needs that communities need, like groceries or gasoline, that kind of stuff, that we do leave to the private sector. But we can assist in various ways in certain communities or certain circumstances where maybe it's warranted. Like, you know, for example, there's the grocery subsidy that exists for remote northern communities, that kind of thing. But I think we need to have that conversation. There's maybe some, I don't know, kind of romantic ideals wrapped up in the idea of the post office and the history of the post office and the Daily Mail we used to get every day. But things have changed in a big way. And I think the conversation really needs to move forward. Well, someone who has followed and studied all of this very closely has written extensively about these issues. On the line with us here on the Rob Breakenridge Show, Dr. Ian Lee is an associate professor at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University, and he joins us on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Professor Lee, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
My pleasure, Rob. Thank you for inviting me.
So first of all, here we are yet again, 5 months after the last job action at Canada Post, and it feels like we cycle through these, but this seems also at the same time like a very short timeline between job actions.
Yeah. Just before we start, I just want to put this out there because I get emails all the time saying you're being paid by Canada Post or the government to say this. I do not consult to Canada Post whatsoever. I do not consult to the unions. I do not consult to the government. I'm a tenured prof. I do not get paid to say this. I've been studying Canada Post since I did my PhD thesis and defended it in 1989. And the one final point I do want to emphasize, because I do think it's critical. I've never interviewed a soul for my 850-page PhD thesis or my 50-odd-page Macdonald-Laurier Institute think tank report from 2015 or my report last August, September. I think it's 50 or 60 pages. Never interviewed a person. People say, how on earth can you be so and talk about it? I only exclusively use the audited annual reports of Canada Post. I have read every report from 1761, when the British Royal Mail established the post office in what was called British North America, all the way down to the creation of Canada in 1867. The Post Office Department was one of the first, it was the 10th statute of the first Parliament to be passed into law. That's how important it was. And I've read every annual report from 1867 to 1981 for my thesis. And then I've read every audited annual report from 1981 until 2024. And there is an incredible amount of data, information, not just money, pieces of mail delivered year by year by year, number of letter carriers versus the number of people in head office versus the number of people in the sorting plants. People don't realize how much data is in those annual reports. They just think it's just about a little bit about money and that's it. So now to your question, because I've dealt with the methodology, all my data comes from the audited annual reports. I argue, and I've been arguing, that there are many people across Canada are really missing two, what I call economic fundamentals that are underneath this debate, and they're completely determining everything that's going on. And the first fundamental reality is that letter mail, physical pieces have collapsed in this country since 2006, from 5.5 billion pieces to 2 billion. And that number continues to decline at 6 to 8 to 10% a year. And I extrapolate from that and predict that the letter mail in this country will vanish somewhere in the next 5 to 7 to 10 years. I've called that, and not that I've only called it, others, the digitization of everything informational. It's affecting your industry, as you know, but it's not just your industry. It's digitized banking and the payment system and the universities and healthcare and everything that's informational. The second fundamental economic reality is the collapse of these numbers. These numbers are in the audited annual report every year. The second is the collapse in market share of parcels, and they're down 50% in 4 years. The last 4 years, they've lost 50%. It doesn't matter what Canada Post says. It doesn't matter what the Prime Minister of Canada says. It doesn't matter what any journalist says. It doesn't matter, much as I respect and admire Andrew Coyne. It doesn't matter if you argue for the privatization of the Post or the abolition of the letter mail monopoly. It does not change the economic reality that letter mail is collapsing and vanishing, number one. And number two, Canada Post is simply not competitive in parcels versus the gigs, the big gig contractors. And this statement is in the audited annual report. They have lost over half their market share, and that number continues to decline. And it doesn't matter what they negotiate or agree to, these two realities are ongoing and continuing. And if they continue with no changes, within 4 or 5 or 6 years, I predict that Canada Post will become what I called in the Globe and Mail op-ed a Potemkin post office, where 65,000 people show up to work every day and will have nothing to do.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, Cup W, I guess, is free to ask for whatever it is they want to ask, but there seems to be kind of a denial of some of the reality here. You have we mentioned the Industrial Inquiry Commission. The commissioner says there's an existential crisis. Canada Post is effectively insolvent, that it makes no sense to try to expand Canada Post into other realms like banking. And yet Cup W wants all of that. It seems they want more money. They want more carriers. They want door to door. They want banking. They want all of that.
Yeah. And Rob, just before I respond to that, because I do get emails, I assure you, almost daily saying I hate unions and all that. I am unionized at Carleton University for 38 years. And I've been on the union pension, union finance committee for the last 5 years. All I'm doing is looking at the data and saying, what does it mean and where's it going? Just very quickly, in terms of what Kaplan said, I agreed with his comments. I read his entire report. I highlighted it throughout in nice yellow on my digital copy, by the way. I don't have a paper copy. I don't have anything paper in my house. It's all digital. All my records are digital, my emails, my reports, and so forth. And it was fascinating seeing the response of the unions, because I've been teaching a course called the Strategy Capstone course for 38 years. And it's in every business school around the world that I've ever looked at. It's the core course you take at the very end of the program. Just like in journalism, there's a capstone course. In political science, there is one in business. And so I make these students look up publicly traded companies and analyze them using StatsCan data and public data and so forth. And you look at the strategies. And where I'm going with this, Rob, is one of the big things in the capstone course is you look at the strategies of companies. And companies that are failing, and this has been studied for, oh my goodness, 50, 100 years. Companies that are failing often go for what I call Hail Mary passes. And they say, we're dying in our core business. So why don't we diversify into that business over there? Because they're growing like crazy and they really look like they're successful. And this strategy is called diversification into unrelated industries. It's been studied to death by McKinsey, by Deloitte, by professors of strategy. Michael Porter has written on this extensively, the famous strategy professor at Harvard. It is a catastrophic failure for a very good reason. Companies that diversify into a new industry that they've never been in, they have no core competencies, they have no infrastructure, they have no supply chains, they have no anything to do with that business, and they're saying we can't make it in the business we've been in for years and years and years, but we're going to go into a brand new business against very established competitors, and we're going to skate, clean their clock. This is fantasy. Right. This is fantasy. The idea that CupW and Canada Post can go into banking. I worked before I went back to school for my master's and my PhD. I was 9 years in commercial banking. I was with Bank of Montreal, lending money to businesses. And the idea that CupW or Canada Post can go up against these 5 big banks that are $1 trillion to $2 trillion each in assets. They've been in banking for over 100 years, Bank of Montreal for over 200 years. And the idea that these people who know zero about banking, I mean zero, can take on and defeat Scotiabank and Royal Bank and TD is beyond ludicrous. I don't mean to put down CupW, but they don't even understand that taking deposits in is an expenditure because you, the deposit-taking institution, have to pay interest on the deposit to the depositor. So when CupW says, let's open up a postal bank and accept deposits, that will drive the costs of the post office up, not down, because you have to pay interest on the deposit to the depositor. You would have to wire up every post office in Canada with these incredibly high-speed, very powerful data links. I mean, the banks have spent literally billions and billions and billions building up their IT infrastructure because banks are all digitized today with very powerful computers, cybersecurity measures, and so forth. Canada Post has absolutely zero IT infrastructure for banking. They have no training in banking. My students with their BComs in accounting and finance go on and do an MBA or a CFA and go into banks. They're very highly demanding in terms of the skill sets. So the idea that the Canada Post can go into banking is beyond preposterous. And I did say that to the Blue Ribbon panel in 2016 that was appointed by then newly elected Prime Minister Trudeau. The other argument they make is going into wellness checks. Well, every province in Canada have home lookups with RNAs and paramedics types who are trained healthcare professionals. I know that because my late mother had wellness checks coming in from the Ontario healthcare system here in Ottawa. And so the idea that people who are not trained as healthcare professionals will suddenly charge into the healthcare space of the 10 provinces and territories across Canada is just is preposterous. It's not going to happen. So they've got to make it very quickly, Rob. Letter mail is declining irrevocably because of the digitization of everything. That's not Canada's Post fault. That's not CupW's fault. This is a generational change, and we're never going back to the old boomer economy, the analog economy of printers and file cabinets and waste paper baskets and so forth. We are become a highly digitized, as are the other countries in the OECD. We're not going back. So that leaves one product line, parcels, and it's booming. StatsCan shows that it's growing 10% a year, e-commerce. The problem is, and I'll throw out some one number, the only number I'm going to give you that is not in the audit annual report because Canada Post refuses to disclose it. And that is, what is the cost per hour per truck in parcels? I contacted Canada Post for my study about a year ago. I said, this is not in your annual report. Can you provide it to me? And they said, we have that data, but we are not giving that to you. This is top secret. This is classified. So I didn't give up on that because I'm a former banker and I do comparative analysis all the time in my classes and strategy. So I went to 2 very large courier companies in Toronto and said, look, I worked in a bank before. I know big companies collect really good data on their competitors to estimate the cost structure, to see how competitive they are against the competitor, their company against the competitor. And they said, of course, we have good data. We have good estimates on what we think Canada Post cost structure is. I said, great. Can you please disclose it to me? I need an average, the average cost per hour of each postal truck on the road, the truck, the driver, and the fuel. They said, we've got that data, but we'll only provide it to you if you don't disclose our identity. I said, of course. I mean, there's only about 4 large courier companies in Canada, so it's not hard to figure out who I talk to. And I said, what is it? And they said, we estimate. And of course, cost of trucks and fuel is very transparent. The collective agreements disclose the cost of the wages, so it's not hard to reverse engineer the cost structure. They said it's about $65 an hour is their estimate for Canada Post trucks that you see driving around every city in Canada. Calgary, Vancouver, doesn't matter. This is an average truck and driver and fuel, because you got to buy the trucks. Okay, I said, what is your cost in these big private courier companies competing? They said, our costs are around $45 an hour for the truck and the driver and the fuel. Hey, I said, you sounds like you got a pretty nice competitive advantage there. Well, no, not exactly, they said to me. I said, what do you mean? He says, the gigs. The gigs. And what's the problem there? Well, they entered the space during the pandemic. That information is in the audited annual reports. And the CEO and the CFO are blaming their collapse on the gigs. So I said to the two people, what's the cost of the gigs? We estimate, they said, $25 an hour for the driver and the car and the fuel, except remember, the gigs own their own car, right? So it's a lower cost structure. So I said, Canada Post is competing with a $65 an hour cost structure against a $25 an hour cost structure. Nobody in this country needs a PhD in microeconomics or an accounting degree or an economics degree. This is arithmetic, everybody. Arithmetic. 25 is much smaller than 65. We learn this in grade 4, 5, and 6 in primary school in arithmetic. So my point is, it's not a secret. It's now we completely understand why Canada Post is hemorrhaging market share in the parcel space. They are not remotely competitive. Now, I know, because I've seen them interviewed across Canada, small business saying, well, I like dealing with Canada Post because their cost for the courier is cheaper than the privates. I agree. They are, by the way. They are. My only answer to all these people is, look, Canada Post is losing money on every last transaction, every letter they deliver, every parcel. How do I know that? Because they're losing money for the whole company on the whole year. Yeah. The audited annual reports are showing that they're losing money. Last year, they lost $1 billion. This year, I think it's going to come in much, much higher because they lost a lot of customers in the strike in November, December. And there's more people shedding their dependence or exiting from being reliant on Canada Post, meaning they're shifting to digital transmission of statements, digital payments. People that were getting physical checks for old age pension, CPP, are switching to digital. And I think that when the numbers do come out, and they will come out, I believe the current year, we're going to see that deficit go from $1 billion. It's probably going to go up to between $1.5 to $2 billion. And next year, it will be larger yet, because these numbers are not static. The number of letters mailed and the revenues there too are going down year by year by year, and their parcel market share is going down year by year, which means their revenues are going down year by year, which means their losses are going up year by year, which means the bailout required is going up year after year after year.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it seems then we got like the worst of all scenarios in the status quo we have, because as you say, the core business is evaporating. It's less relevant to most Canadians. But as we saw in the last strike, I mean, it still had quite a toll on businesses, especially smaller businesses, right? Estimated losses somewhere in the realm of $1 billion. So there's enough of a dependency where these strikes hurt.
Yes.
But it's not enough to save Canada Post, is it?
That's right. That's exactly right. Rob, what I recommended in my report, and I had some really radical recommendations in there, I said, and the universal service obligation. So did Kaplan, by the way. The idea that we have approximately 50,000 postal workers marching up and down the streets of Canada to 17.4 million addresses, business and residential, and that is in the audited annual report for those who want to know where that number came from, marching up and down Canada. 17.4 million addresses, 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year is killing us. It's killing Canada Post, I should say. And so there isn't enough volume, and they're losing money on that. So we got to amend, the government has to amend the USO, Universal Service Obligation, to remove mandatory 5-day-a-week delivery. That will, by the way, require a lot less workers. That's a downsizing, by the way. I'm not sugarcoating it, anybody. I also recommended franchising all 3,600 remaining corporate-owned post offices. Again, I go into them as part of my research in the rural where I grew up in Eastern Ontario many years ago. I go into urban post offices. Doesn't matter what time of the day. Doesn't matter if spring, fall, winter. They're empty. There's nobody there. Why? Because nobody's writing letters and going and buying postage stamps. Why would you go to a post office if you're not writing letters? And so I said franchise those because the Loblaws and the Shoppers and and these other stores, it's a traffic builder for them, so they love that, and so that will save you money. And then I said so that will address that problem, and they've got to go to dynamic route scheduling where they consolidate routes across Canada, so that if you have 5 routes that only have very small volumes, you consolidate them on a day-by-day basis to reflect the demand for those routes. Again, that's going to require far fewer workers. I estimate, if you go and look at any of the major courier companies in this country, they've got 5,000, 7,000, 8,000 employees. Canada Post has 65,000. If we restructure Canada Post to be purely focusing on parcels, I think we're talking a company that's going to be 15,000, maybe 20,000. We're talking a downsizing of 40,000 or more, which is enormous. One final point, Rob, because I don't want to miss this, because I know you're in Calgary, and I came out of rural Eastern Ontario. There are, I estimate, maybe 10 to 15% of the Canadian population that doesn't have private courier service. Most of us live in the cities, and everybody in the cities has all kinds of courier alternatives. But there is Northern Ontario, rural Quebec, rural Eastern Ontario, rural Alberta, rural Saskatchewan, where they're in hamlets and villages, maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 houses, no private couriers. I argue that in the restructuring, I do not support privatization. I do not support just, quote, shutting it down. I believe out of the ashes of the current structure that's hemorrhaging and bleeding to death, that we're going to need to create a reconstituted post office that will focus not on the cities, not on Vancouver, where most of the people have deserted the post office, not on Calgary, not on Ottawa, not on Toronto. Focus on rural and remote Canada, rural Maritimes, rural Nova Scotia, rural Alberta, and because they need the post office, whether it's for letters or parcels. And there's no alternative. In the cities across Canada, there are just a plethora of alternatives, all kinds of alternatives. And I just want to put one more thing out there. Cup W will probably be shocked I'm saying this. I think it's inevitable that it will be brought back in as a service of government if this really constituted post office is created to service essentially the rural and remote parts of Canada. They can't possibly make money because the densities are too small. People are too far apart. I grew up on a farm. My nearest neighbor was a mile away. That's 1.6 kilometers away. And that was our nearest neighbor. Okay. So what I'm saying is we will have a much, much smaller post office, and Cup W does not, I don't think, believes in this vision whatsoever, but I think that's where we're going to evolve towards inevitably because it's driven by the economic fundamentals. So there will be a post office for those people in rural Saskatchewan and rural Alberta and rural Eastern Ontario, so they will be covered and protected because there's no alternative. And that's why we will have an alternative there called the newly restructured Canada Post. But where Canada Post is dying in the cities. It's dying in the cities.
Well, that's the thing, as you say, I mean, it is something worth saving, but just how difficult that's going to be, even something as simple as transitioning to community mailboxes was a huge fight, let alone the kinds of restructuring and reform you say are necessary. So how difficult is this going to be?
I think, and I'll be very blunt, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. And, I'm tenured. I can speak truth to power. I really can. The government of Canada, and it is an exclusive federal jurisdiction, a responsibility under the Constitution Act of Canada. They're facing 2 unbelievably ugly choices. Let's use the first one, restructuring. The only way this can be restructured is not through Canada Post. They don't have any mandate to rip up the collective agreement that gave job security to almost all the workers. They don't have the money. They don't have a pen that can print billions of dollars to fund and finance the restructuring. That's the Minister of Finance. That's the Prime Minister of Canada. That's going to require a bill being tabled in Parliament. And I can predict, I think everyone listening is going to say, yes, of course. Every union will come out, understandably, in solidarity with CUPW, and they'll say, wait a minute, you're ripping up those rights that they earned at the bargaining table. Of course, the urban-rural divide, there will be people in the rural screaming. There will be mayors across Canada. There will be premiers. Every person's going to have an opinion on this, and it's going to cost billions and billions of dollars. This is not a free lunch. So some might say, and CUPW, I believe their real position is, just leave it alone. And if it runs up losses, just pay them and just let the post office continue. The problem with that is that deficit, right now, what's $1 billion a year to a government of Canada that has $500 billion this year in revenues, which it does. I looked it up. So what's $1 billion, people say, for national, the good that the post office is delivering. The problem is next year it won't be $1 billion. Next year it'll be $2 billion. And the year after that, it's going to be $3 or $4 billion. And there's going to be large numbers of other Canadians saying, wait a minute. That money could be going into healthcare where we have long lineups and lots of Canadians don't have a medical doctor, a GP. What about the border? Beefing up the border? What about environment? I mean, you name it. We need more transportation of energy infrastructure. What about that? And so both alternatives are going to have huge numbers of critics. It's going to be extremely controversial and extremely ugly. But there's no real alternative. Just there is a subset to the restructuring. I could see somebody saying, okay, you don't lay them off and abrogate the collective agreement. Why don't we do voluntary buyouts and incentivize them? I think the blowback from the court of public opinion in Canada, if somebody in the government said, okay, we're going to offer $150,000 to each postal worker to quit, to go away, I think there's going to be all hell will break loose in Canada. People say, you're giving my taxpayer money and giving that person $150,000 or $200,000 to quit their job. And so that's a variant of the downsizing restructuring, whether you do it voluntary or involuntary. But either way, it's going to be massively expensive. And both alternatives, they call it the status quo, just leave the post office alone and let it run losses, or the restructuring, both will be unbelievably controversial. And both will be unbelievably expensive to the taxpayers of Canada. So we have no good choices.
Yeah. Well, we'll see where this all goes from here. We'll leave it there for now. Dr. Lee, some great insight on this. Thank you so much for making some time for us here today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Rob. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
We've all driven it at some point, whether it's within our own province, perhaps even across a good chunk, or maybe even the entirety of the country. The Trans-Canada Highway links this country from coast to coast, but it is something we take for granted, both in terms of how difficult it was to build in the first place and just how impactful it was for this country. Fascinating new book delves into the history and the legacy of the highway. It's called Canada's Main Street: The Epic Story of the Trans-Canada Highway. Craig Baird is the author of the book. He's also creator and host of the podcast Canadian History X, EHX, CanadaEHX.com. Craig, so great to have you with us. Congrats on the book and welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me.
So let's talk about what, I guess, kind of motivated you to tell this story. I mean, as part of this, and you look at how we think of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, for example, is this about giving this highway its due?
Absolutely. And you bring up the CPR, and when we look at that in our history, it has almost a mythology around it of building across the country, all the things that went into it. I mean, Pierre Burton wrote 2 volumes just about the building of the CPR. And I just felt like the Trans-Canada Highway was just as important to Canada's history, but wasn't really getting that attention, or like you said, getting its dues. And I think it's because we all use it. Every single person uses the Trans-Canada Highway at least once in their lives. I mean, if you live in Calgary and you drive to Peters Drive-In, you're driving on 16th Avenue, that's the Trans-Canada Highway. And we just don't really equate that. We don't think of the fact that you can stay on that road all the way to Halifax, or, all the way to Vancouver and then on to Victoria. And it just doesn't have that same impact, even though it is a really major part of our history and a part of our culture.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating story, and it's one of those things where there's not really like a hero of this story. There's not really someone you can point to and say, here's who we have to thank for the Trans-Canada Highway. I mean, it took so long just to bring it about in the first place, and so many people had a role in making this happen. So how do you boil that down in a way to understand who really was responsible?
Well, I mean, like you said, it doesn't really have that one person. When we look at the CPR, we can say, oh, well, Sir John A. Macdonald was really the one who pushed that, and Sir Sanford Fleming was the one who surveyed a bunch of it. So we have these big figures in our history attached to it, but we don't have that with the Trans-Canada Highway. We have various governments. I mean, kind of, you start to get the first inklings of it under William Lyon Mackenzie King, and then his successor, Louis Saint Laurent, who brings in the Trans-Canada Highway Act in 1949. He's eventually ousted, and that brings in John Diefenbaker, and then he's ousted, and that brings in Lester B. Pearson. So you have 4 different prime ministers all kind of playing a part. And if we look at the building of the highway from 1949 to essentially 1971, you can also bring Pierre Trudeau in there. So that's 5 prime ministers, so many different names, all having a part in the building of this highway. And we do have, certain bigger names with it. Joey Smallwood and his drive for 65 and having the highway built in that time, and in Newfoundland, and various other things. But there's no real major figures that kind of dominate the discussion or anything like that. And I think that's because of how it was done, with the federal government and the provincial government kind of splitting the responsibilities.
So 1949 is kind of the beginning, but it's almost in a way like the end of the beginning, right? So you get this whole chunk leading up to 1949 where this has been kicked around, debated, discussed. Then after 1949, the whole process of actually doing this. So really we're talking about, decades in the making, right?
Absolutely. With the rise of the automobile in the 1910s and onwards, the first people to drive across Canada, quote unquote, were Thomas Wilby and Jack Haney, who were, one was an American, one was British. Jack Haney eventually became Canadian, but they didn't really even drive across Canada. They were on the train tracks for a time. They were on a train for a time. Were on a barge on Lake Superior because there was no roads. And so that's kind of where the start of the story of the Trans-Canada Highway begins. And that's why I began my book with their story. And it really wasn't until about 1947 or so that you actually had somebody drive across the country only on a road, only in Canada, because people used to just go down into the United States to skip over huge portions of the country. But you had all these highways starting to be built through the country in the 1930s as, projects for unemployed men during the Depression, and the 1940s, the Crow's Nest Highway, the Big Bend in British Columbia, the highway through Northern Ontario. So you did have all these highways starting, but there wasn't really like anything connecting them all as one single highway, with certain requirements of how that highway had to be built and all of that. And so you did start to see that as we get into the post-war era. More people have vehicles, more people want tourism. Towns are saying, we don't want people driving into the United States to get somewhere. We want them coming through our community to help build our community. And then you start to get closer to that, and then 1949 hits.
Yeah, I guess even today people still do drive through the United States, depending on where they're going. But how much of this was that kind of nationalist enterprise? Because some of it's economic, obviously, or trying to encourage Americans to come up and see Canada. But how much of this was a nation-building exercise?
I think when you compare it to the CPR, it's nowhere near like that. With CPR, it was building across this, huge landmass. It was ensuring that British Columbia was part of Canada. It was creating settlement in the Canadian West. With the Trans-Canada Highway, there was a little bit of nationalism because the Americans were building their interstates. So we were thinking, well, if they can build all these interstates, we can at least build one road across this country. They built the Alaska Highway for us. Essentially, we can do this. But then I think the main thing was economics. It was tourism. It was attracting people from the United States into Canada to drive that road, see Canada, but also to keep Canadians in Canada. And when you look at where that highway goes, its route is decided by tourist aspects. It could have gone through northern Ontario, but it hugs Lake Superior and those beautiful vistas of Lake Superior. It goes through Banff rather than, lower down through the Crow's Nest Pass or higher up through Jasper. In Newfoundland, it makes sure it hits various provincial parks and national parks. So tourism is a major factor with this, of encouraging people to drive the country and see the country and, spread the money around.
I mean, it's funny, you alluded to, I mean, some of the wild stories of the early attempts to drive across Canada and just these early vehicles, and I don't know how they held up and what would, I guess, kind of charitably be called roads. So it is pretty wild. Even by 1949, what was considered a road or a highway? Are we talking about divided highways, wide highways, paved highways by that point?
Well, I think you'd be wishful thinking if you hoped for like a divided highway in Canada in 1949 for sure, and a paved highway was like, oh, this is great, this is nice.
Yeah.
The majority was gravel, and like you said, people were really, when they were taking their vehicles out, you were assuming you're probably going to have 3 or 4 flat tires because of the ruts in the road and all of that, and taking the family on a nice cross country drive, you could do it in 9 straight days if you just kept driving constantly. But back then it was much longer because A, you couldn't drive as fast because you didn't have paved roads, and B, because you were constantly stopping. Gas stations were few and far between, and you didn't have as many paved roads. And even with the Trans-Canada Highway, when John Diefenbaker stamps it down in the not the Crow's Nest Pass, but Rogers Pass, and says the highway's finished, the highway's open, there were still huge sections that were still gravel. Like, it wasn't technically done. There was a road that kind of connected the two oceans, but there was still a lot of work to that. And like I mentioned, Newfoundland didn't finish its road till 1965, and even then portions were still gravel. So when you were driving anywhere in Canada, you were driving on gravel roads, and you were assuming that at some point you're going to have a flat tire, or your vehicle's going to break down, and you're going to hit some huge pothole in the middle of the gravel road that's going to, annihilate your axle. And anybody who's grown up in rural Canada, like, I mean, I grew up in rural Alberta, and you know how rough gravel roads are today. Now think of how they were, 70 years ago.
We're talking, 75 years ago, but I think so much of the political debate would sound familiar today. I mean, is this too expensive? Who's going to pay for this? Is this federal jurisdiction, provincial jurisdiction, even within provinces? And it was a big thing here in Alberta, right? Fighting over where this highway is going to go. All of that political tug of war. I mean, it was very much part of this story.
It really was. And when you look at it, it's amazing that it was even built. Like, I think we'd have a lot of trouble now trying to get it built because we can't seem to really agree on anything across the country. And with the Trans-Canada Highway, the federal government, all the parties agreed that we needed a highway. But like you said, it was about who's going to pay for this? How much is it going to cost? So the Liberals, they wanted 50-50. Provinces pay 50% and the federal government pays 50%. The Progressive Conservatives under George Drew, they wanted to pay 100%, and the CCF was the same thing. So there was a lot of debate about how it was going to go about. But eventually it was 50-50. The end date for the construction was put at 1957. Saskatchewan was the only place that actually was able to build to the deadline. Everybody else couldn't. So they had to extend it, and that resulted in the federal government making the decision to actually pay more of the highway to get it built faster. So what they said was, we will pay 90% of the 10% most difficult portions in your province. And that helps get things moving a bit faster. But yeah, it really comes down to that. And then the most difficult part is the federal government says, each of the provinces has to decide where the highway is going to go. And if you have Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, okay, well, it's pretty easy to figure out where that highway is going to go. But when you start to get into Ontario, is it going to go through Ottawa? Is it going to go through Toronto? Will it take the northern route, or is it going to hug Lake Superior? And then you get to the prairies and you split off after Winnipeg. And now is it going to go through Saskatoon, Edmonton, Jasper? Is it going to go through Calgary and Banff, or even branches off there, Lethbridge and the Crow's Nest Pass? So Alberta had 3 different routes to choose, and they also had to make sure they chose the same route that was going to make it easy for Saskatchewan and BC, so you didn't have this zigzagging highway trying to hit all the communities that wanted to have the highway. I mean, Edmonton fought hard to get this highway.
Yeah. Well, and it really shaped these cities moving forward. You think about what Alberta might look like today if it had gone through Edmonton, or even if it had gone through Lethbridge. I mean, how different might Lethbridge be today? So it just speaks to how consequential this highway was.
Without a doubt, and I think that probably the best example of that is Banff and Jasper. When I go from Jasper to Banff, often feel like I'm driving from a small town to Disneyland because you go from Jasper where you can park on the street. It's relatively small. You take that beautiful highway through the mountains, and then you reach Banff, and then suddenly there's like buses of tourists being picked up and driven into the community, and there's so many people. And the Trans Canada Highway is a big part of that because it really helped build Banff up as the premier destination in the mountains. Now, if it was reversed, I think Jasper might have been built up a lot more versus Banff. But yeah, I think that if it had gone through Edmonton, or even if it had gone through Saskatoon, then Edmonton, Lloydminster would be a much larger community because of the Trans-Canada Highway. So it really did help some communities and then hurt some communities because they were bypassed.
And I mean, obviously, the story isn't about, we didn't just build a highway from scratch from one coast to the other. It did involve kind of what's already there. And I mean, that's a part of the story here too, right? I mean, Banff was established even 100 years ago, right? Banff was a pretty important national park and destination. We had some experience already in building roads to there and through there. So when you look at Alberta specifically or elsewhere where there was existing road infrastructure, how much did that play into where this highway was going to go?
It played into it quite a bit. I mean, when you're thinking Edmonton to Jasper, the Yellowhead Association, who were pushing to get the Trans-Canada Highway built through Edmonton, they did a convoy or a caravan, they called it, from Edmonton all the way to Kamloops because they were trying to show that there is a road here. We can use this road. And it was a gravel road. Like it wasn't a paved road like it is now. And a lot of people were pushing for the Crow's Nest Highway because it was the most developed highway in Alberta at that time. So it was felt like this would be the easiest one to build. But obviously, building through Banff, I think, and Calgary was really the most important aspect for Alberta because you had a major city and then you had a major tourist destination. And also, building through national parks was beneficial because the federal government was paying for all of the highway through national parks. So going through Crow's Nest Pass is great. You do have a highway there, but you don't have a national park that you're driving through like you would with Banff or even Jasper. But having that road infrastructure was good. It was a matter of upgrading it and getting it to the specifications that the federal government wanted. And really that meant turning a gravel road into an actual highway.
Yeah, it's funny because you might have assumed going through the mountains would have been the hardest part of all of this. I don't know. By 1949, it's almost like we were kind of good at that, and there were a lot of challenges elsewhere in the country. Where were the biggest challenges in doing this?
Yeah, like you said, going through Banff, the highway was there. It might have been kind of a rudimentary highway, but it still was there. You weren't blazing through the bush trying to get a highway built. Where you really saw challenges were parts of British Columbia. There were a lot of bridges that had to be built, and that cost a lot of money. And then, especially in Ontario over Lake Superior, because there wasn't really a highway there, there was train that went through there, and that's when you have communities like Wawa getting the highway. And within a year of the highway going through, you have the Wawa Goose suddenly appearing because they see the importance of getting people to come to the community because the highway doesn't always go through a community. It's, 2 or 3 kilometers north of that community. And granted, it goes through Calgary and it goes through Regina, but these smaller communities are just a little bit bypassed. So they need to do something to draw the people in. You also saw a lot of difficulty in places like Newfoundland, where you were also building through kind of virgin territory to get this highway built because they weren't going from St. John's to the next coast. They were going through the top of the community or the top of the province because they had to get all of the communities they could onto that highway. And the Kenzo Causeway in Nova Scotia was a huge project to connect Cape Breton Island with the Nova Scotia mainland, and that was part of building the Trans-Canada Highway. Now, some provinces had it very easy. Saskatchewan was more or less building over flat land, and it was easy. PEI also had it very easy because there wasn't a lot of highway there, but then there were a lot of bigger construction projects, especially through cities like Montreal and such, where the highway had to be upgraded, interchanges, tunnels, all of that.
Well, and it's interesting. I think we've seen this more recently too, where we build these major new highway projects because people want to get where they're going as fast as they can. They don't want to have to make stops or slow down through towns and cities. But it's always kind of the argument, wasn't it, over the years? And maybe it was part of this conversation that, you're bypassing these towns and there's something to be said for going through a small town and having to slow down or having to stop. How much did that factor into building this highway, right? The speed and convenience versus linking all of these communities?
Well, I think their main concern was hitting the major cities and not so much the small towns. And like you said, the towns were kind of bypassed. They were usually either right near the highway or a few kilometers away from the highway. So they really had to draw those people off the highway. But then with building through the cities, at first it seems like a great idea. Cool, we're going through downtown Ottawa, or we're going through straight through Calgary. But then as there's more cars on the road, these people who are driving across the country are suddenly saying, I don't want to drive through rush hour Ottawa to get to my destination. I'm not trying to stop in Ottawa. And that's where you start getting ring roads appearing, in Calgary and Winnipeg and Ottawa and all these other places, because people are like, I just want to get to my destination. I'm not trying to buy anything in this city. But back in 1949, where it was much smaller, there was less cars, you could drive through the downtown core, pull off and go get something to eat, get back in the car and continue driving. You weren't dealing with the rush hour that you have now. So you do see changes to the highway over time because of that. You have the communities, smaller ones, building roadside attractions to get people to come in, Husky the Muskie in Kenora, for example. And then you have cities building ring roads to keep people going around the city, but also hoping that they maybe stop in the city.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, you alluded to the Yellowhead and the Crow's Nest Highway, and those are well developed now in Alberta. And it's kind of thing across the country. You can get across the country, and really, you could avoid the Trans-Canada Highway for the most part. Not to mention the shortcuts to the U.S. or other ways of traveling. So, I mean, I don't know. Does the Trans-Canada matter as much today, do you think?
I think it does. I think, in terms of our history and our culture, the Trans-Canada Highway is always there. I mean, Terry Fox ran on the Trans-Canada, and Rick Hansen was on the Trans-Canada. Like, it does play a part in our culture. Now, in terms of does it matter as much? Well, people, if I'm outside of Edmonton, so a lot of people here are going to be like, well, I don't want to drive to Toronto. I'm going to fly to Toronto. Yeah. So the advent of the airplane and commercial flights definitely does change the importance. When you're driving the Trans-Canada Highway on a long trip, you're usually doing it for maybe 9-10 hours at most, and anything more that you're flying, unless the purpose is, I want to drive the Trans-Canada Highway across the country. Like this year, I'm driving the Trans-Canada Highway across the country because I want to see the country, and the Trans-Canada Highway, I still feel, is the best way to do that. But like you said, from pretty much Winnipeg all the way to the Pacific Coast, I can drive across the country without being on the Trans-Canada because I can take the Yellowhead. And I can take a good portion of Ontario without the Trans-Canada Highway because I can take the Northern Road. But all of those are still part of the Trans-Canada Highway network, even though they're not the official number one highway.
Well, the book is called Canada's Main Street, The Epic Story of the Trans-Canada Highway. It's available this month. Much more is mentioned, CanadaEHX.com. Craig, again, congrats on the book and appreciate the conversation. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Thanks for having me.
Once again, our thanks to Craig Baird. His book, Canada's Main Street, The Epic Story of the Trans-Canada Highway, an epic story indeed. Also, our thanks to Ian Lee at Carleton University, Sprott School of Business, conversation about Canada Post, and of course, Philippe Lagassé, also at Carleton University, and Norman Patterson School of International Affairs, talking about the throne speech and some of the defense priorities for this government. So coming up on episode 4, which will drop on Friday, we'll talk more about this week's session of Parliament and where this Carney government is going. We're also going to be chatting with economist Mike Moffat, some interesting insight on the housing problem in Canada, what this government can do and governments across the country can do to deal with the housing problem. We'll also be joined by Franco Terrazzano with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. They put out some new numbers with regard to pensions for some of the exiting MPs, including, of course, the now former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. We'll talk about the fact that we're not going to see a federal budget until the fall. But also, Franco Terrazzano is the author of a new book looking at some of the debate around the carbon tax, which, of course, Mark Carney axed. It's one of his first acts as Prime Minister, but perhaps this debate isn't over, so we'll get into all of that with Franco Terrazzano. That and much more coming up at our next podcast, which, as mentioned, we will have for you on Friday. Enjoy the rest of the week, folks. My name is Rob Breakenridge. This is The Rob Breakenridge Show. We'll talk to you later this week.